Zachariah Bennett was the kind of man you didn't question. He stood straight in every family photo, always on the far right with his hand on someone's shoulder. His eyes carried a warmth that seemed honest, even when they flickered with something he never named. At church, people whispered his name with a quiet reverence. That's Pastor Bennett's eldest, the one who found his way back. He was the golden boy of redemption, the prodigal son who didn't stray too far, the living proof that faith could cure even what some in town still called the affliction. But what they didn't see, what none of them ever asked about, was the boy who once loved another boy named Noah, the 17-year-old who wrote letters under his mattress and kissed a hand in the dark behind the school's gymnasium. The boy who came out in tears one summer evening and was driven to a so-called retreat for healing, where the love he had was turned into shame, and the only thing he learned was how to survive by erasing himself. He came back different, quieter, straighter. He called it just a phase. Everyone clapped. His father wept from the pulpit, and Zachariah kept his hands folded in prayer, even as a quiet death settled into his spirit. Years passed, and no one dared to bring it up again. He met a kind woman, married her, taught theology, wrote papers about spiritual resilience and the cost of sin. Every word polished, every life choice calculated. And yet at night when the house was still, he found himself replaying old songs Noah used to hum while studying their melody, faint like a ghost, that still hadn't left his chest. It wasn't that Zachariah hated who he had been. He just believed he had no right to be that boy anymore. He had chosen his path, hadn't he? Chosen the family over the truth, the church over his own heart. And wasn't that what love was supposed to look like? A sacrifice, clean and silent. But sometimes the silence felt like a burial. One day he received a text from his youngest brother Elijah. It was simple, just 12 words: "I'm gay, and I'm not going to hide like you did." He stared at the screen as if the letters were written in fire. The same last name, the same blood, but a different kind of courage. And in that moment, Zachariah felt something unravel inside, something he had stitched too tightly for too long. A part of him wanted to reply right away, to tell Elijah that it was okay, that he understood. Another part, the part raised on sermons and Sunday guilt, wanted to delete the message and pretend it hadn't happened. Pretend that the past hadn't returned wearing his brother's voice. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. And sometimes it returns through someone you love, asking you to choose again. Not for them, but for yourself. Zachariah looked out the window of his study that night, watching the sky split open with thunder, wondering how long he could keep pretending that the storm hadn't already begun. And if you've ever been forced to bury a part of yourself just to be accepted, or if you've watched someone you love carry a truth you weren't brave enough to hold, then keep watching. Because this story isn't just about Zachariah, it's about the cost of silence and the power of finally being seen. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more real powerful journeys like this one. The morning after Elijah's message, Zachariah didn't pray. He brewed hot his coffee, like always 2 sugars, no cream, and stood by the kitchen sink watching the condensation bleed down the window. His wife was still asleep upstairs. The house was still respectful, curated like every part of his life. But inside him, there was a shaking, subtle at first like a tremor beneath the floorboards. By the time the sun cut through the blinds, Zachariah felt it in his chest. He hadn't responded. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because every possible word tasted like betrayal, either to his brother or to the man he'd worked so hard to become. In the family group chat, the silence was already cracking. His father had forwarded an email from church leadership. A Christian home must correct and protect. Confusion is not an identity. Attached was a list of resources for families facing sexual deception. Zachariah scrolled past them. Then came the voice note from their father. "Elijah, this family loves you, but love means discipline. You are not gay. You are under attack, and we will not let you be lost like others have been." He didn't say Zachariah's name, but the implication hung like smoke in a sealed room. For the first time in years, Zachariah felt that old teenage fear, raw, guttural, familiar. The memory of sitting in a chair across from 3 pastors in Kentucky, being told his soul was in danger because of who he held hands with. How his mother had cried behind the door. How no one ever asked if he was okay, only whether he was ready to change. He had, at least outwardly. And now Elijah was walking into that same fire, but instead of hiding, he was naming it. Zachariah opened Elijah's profile on Instagram. There was a new post, a photo of Elijah smiling in a hoodie under it. The caption, I'm not a phase, I'm a person, I'm proud of who I am. The comment section was a war-zone church members, quoting Leviticus cousins telling him to stay off social media with that agenda, and a few brave souls writing simply, thank you. Zachariah saw one name that made his breath hitch. Noah Carrington had left a heart emoji. He hadn't heard that name in over a decade. Zachariah clicked the profile. Noah's bio read, author, advocate, unapologetically alive. His latest post was a flyer he was speaking at a national conference on faith and queer identity in Nashville. The same weekend, Zachariah's university was hosting a theology summit just 6 blocks apart. The past wasn't just echoing, it was arriving full-voiced and uninvited. At dinner that night, Zachariah's wife asked why he seemed quiet. He said work was heavy. She smiled gently and asked no further. They lived like that, tender, respectful, distant. She had once found an old photo of Zachariah and Noah tucked behind an outdated Bible commentary. He had told her it was from a missions trip. She hadn't asked more. Maybe she already knew. That night, Zachariah sat in his office and wrote Elijah a message. I'm sorry for not replying. I'm proud of you. I know this is hard. I know what dad is like, what the church will say. I've lived it. I don't know how to help you when I didn't even know how to help myself. He stared at the blinking cursor, his fingers hovered over the send button, then deleted the message. Instead, he typed a single sentence. Can we talk this weekend? Elijah replied in seconds. Of course, I've been hoping you would. And just like that, a conversation that should have happened 20 years ago was starting. Not with a confession, not with a sermon, but with two brothers meeting at the threshold of something neither of them could name yet. Something that looked a little like hope and a lot like reckoning. Zachariah didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch in his coat, staring out at the dark Tennessee sky. Somewhere in this same town, Noah was packing for his talk. Somewhere else, Elijah was probably scrolling through a list of safe housing options. And here he was in between them both. The man who once escaped the fire, only to realize he'd brought the ashes home with him. He whispered into the dark, I'm still here, aren't I? But he didn't know if it was a prayer or an apology. By Friday, the quiet was over. It began with a poster. Zachariah was walking through the breezeway of his university's theology building when he saw it. A glossy flyer taped to the bulletin board beside the vending machine. His name in large serif letters. Professor Zachariah Bennett, guest panelist, Faith and Identity in the Modern Age. And right below in another font under a separate event, keynote speaker Noah Carrington, Surviving Scripture, Reclaiming Self, the two names side by side, unintended, unavoidable. He stood there longer than necessary. A student passed, then another. No one said anything. No one had to. The tension had started to thicken like summer air before a storm. In the staff lounge, the whispers had already begun. A colleague mentioned Noah's upcoming talk with a smirk, saying how brave it was to invite such progressive voices. Another added, well, Zachariah will offer a strong counterpoint. Zachariah didn't respond. He just nodded politely and stirred his tea, letting the words settle like dust on a closed book. But inside, something was splintering. That evening, he sat alone at his desk, thumbing through an old journal he had once sworn to burn. Between its pages were fragments, lines of poetry never spoken, names carved in margins, the faint outline of a letter he once tried to write to Noah but never sent. Back then, Noah had begged him not to lie to himself, not to disappear behind the doctrine. They both knew too well. Zachariah had looked him in the eye and said, you'll understand one day. Noah never did. He left town, wrote books, spoke on stages, lived out loud. Zachariah stayed, got married, built a life designed not for joy but for safety. And now the boy he once loved had returned, not for him, but for the same message he once abandoned. The following morning, Elijah arrived. Zachariah met him at a coffee shop on the edge of campus, hoping the neutral ground would make things easier. It didn't. Elijah looked thinner, older than he should at 18. His eyes carried the weary alertness of someone who'd already learned not to expect softness from the world. They ordered quietly, sat across from each other like strangers. It was Elijah who spoke first. I saw the poster. You're speaking the same day as him. Zachariah didn't ask how he knew. It's a coincidence, he muttered. Oh, Elijah said. It's not. There was a long silence, the kind that dared either of them to break it with the truth. Finally, Zachariah spoke, his voice low. You think I'm a coward? Elijah didn't answer right away. When he did, it was gentler than expected. I think you were scared. I think you still are. Zachariah looked away out the window to the students crossing the campus green. He envied them, their obliviousness, their freedom. I told myself I was protecting everyone. Mom, Dad, the church, even myself, but you weren't protecting me, Elijah said quietly. I grew up thinking something was wrong with me because the only person like me pretended he wasn't. The words landed like a blow. Zachariah's throat tightened. I never wanted that for you, he whispered. Then stop letting it be true, Elijah replied. The weight of the conversation settled between them, too heavy for small talk. When they finally parted, it was with a hug that trembled more than held a grip. Both of them were afraid to loosen. Later that evening, Zachariah received an email. Subject line: panel discussion logistics. Urgent. Inside was a list of final talking points and expectations. At the bottom, an unexpected note. Noah Carrington has requested a joint Q&A with Professor Bennett following both presentations, citing shared history and mutual insight. Zachariah's hand hovered over the keyboard. Declining would be easy, expected safe. But Elijah's voice echoed in his mind. Stop letting it be true. He clicked reply, then typed confirmed. The air in his office felt suddenly too still, as if something invisible had just shifted. That night, Zachariah stood at the bathroom mirror, longer than usual. His face, worn with choices, stared back. For years, he had convinced himself he had time, that silence was a form of wisdom, that shadows were safer than the sun. But the past doesn't stay quiet. And sometimes it comes back wearing your name, asking you to speak before someone else is silenced the way you once were. The auditorium was packed, not the kind of packed Zachariah was used to, the orderly gatherings of faith scholars and polite applause after scripted lectures. This was different. The seats buzzed with a strange energy, a mixture of anticipation and something else, something raw. Younger students, local press, LGBTQ+ advocates, and quietly curious churchgoers all sat shoulder to shoulder. Some came to listen, others came to watch. Zachariah stood backstage, palms damp. He could hear Noah's voice through the monitor, measured, warm, unwavering. I used to think God hated me, Noah said, because that's what I was told. That queerness was rebellion, that love had to follow a script or it wasn't holy. But here's what they didn't tell me. God doesn't whisper shame. People do. The room stayed silent, listening, absorbing. Zachariah clenched his jaw. He hadn't seen Noah in 13 years, not even in passing. But the moment he stepped into the green room earlier that day, it was as if time folded in on itself. Noah had turned, looked at him, and for a second, neither of them said anything. Just stood there, two men with years unspoken, pain unresolved, and a truth neither had forgotten. Noah had been first to speak. I thought you'd back out. Zachariah had answered without thinking. So did I. They hadn't hugged. There was no bitterness, no apology, just a mutual understanding that what lay ahead would not be small. Now, as Zachariah waited for his cue, he looked out over the audience from behind the curtain and saw Elijah sitting in the middle row, flanked by two classmates. His face was unreadable, but his presence felt like an anchor in the storm. The moderator's voice broke his thoughts. Please welcome Professor Zachariah Bennett. He stepped out into the lights. The applause was polite, uncertain. Some clapped out of respect, others perhaps out of curiosity. Zachariah stood behind the podium, hands on either side of the wood, and stared out at the sea of faces. The speech he'd prepared lay folded in his coat pocket. He didn't reach for it. I had a different talk planned, he began. His voice was clear, steady, too calm for the war in his chest. I've spent most of my life learning how to say what people want to hear, how to be the kind of man others could point to and say, see, that's what redemption looks like. A pause, but I think you deserve the truth. He looked straight into the lights, knowing full well the cameras were rolling. His father might see this, his university, his church, his wife. But for the first time, none of them could touch the space he was about to step into. When I was 17, he said slowly, I fell in love with someone. A boy. His name was Noah. The room didn't move, not a cough, not a breath, I told my family. And the response was swift: correction, isolation, a 6-month healing program. When I came back, I told them it had been a phase. I lied. I lied because I thought it would save me, and in a way it did. But what I didn't understand was that it also buried me. He glanced briefly at Noah, whose expression remained calm, but unreadable. I spent the next decade teaching others how to silence themselves politely. I called it theology. I called it discipline. I called it God. But the truth is, I was just afraid I sold safety as salvation. There were tears now, quiet ones in corners of the room, some from older attendees who had made similar compromises. Some from a student still living in half-truths, and then my little brother came out. He continued, and I realized he was braver at 18 than I've ever been. He turned slightly to acknowledge Elijah, who now stared at him with wide, stunned eyes. I don't stand here as an expert, Zachariah said. I stand here as someone trying finally not to disappear. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause could have been. Then the moderator returned and gestured toward the center of the stage. 2 chairs. One nameplate read Noah Carrington, the other Zachariah Bennett. They sat down across from each other. The lights were gentler to now the room dimmed. Noah leaned forward. What changed? Zachariah met his gaze. I stopped believing the lie was safer than the truth. Noah nodded slowly. And what about love? Zachariah's voice trembled just once. I think I've still got time to find it. If I stop running, the moderator asked one last question. What would you say to someone watching this, afraid to speak? Zachariah didn't look at the audience. He looked at Elijah. I'd say, silence won't save you. It only teaches the next person to hide better. When they stood for closing remarks, the applause was no longer polite. It was full and raw and real. And for the first time since he was a boy, Zachariah didn't flinch from the sound. In the days that followed, Zachariah expected the collapse. He waited for the university to call him in to quote clauses from his contract about moral conduct and representational alignment. He anticipated voicemails from board members coded, concern from donors, the unspoken but certain truth that respectability doesn't always survive honesty, but nothing came, at least not right away. What came first was a letter handwritten, torn at the edges, from his father. You've broken your mother's memory. I don't know who you are anymore. I pray for your soul. There was no signature, just a scribbled verse from Romans and the seal of their old church. Zachariah folded the letter once, then again, and slid it into the back of the drawer where he kept things he no longer prayed over. What came next were emails from students, former classmates, even strangers who had watched the panel online. Some wrote in short sentences, trembling with unsaid years. Thank you. I've never heard someone like me speak like that. Others were pages long, pouring out decades of silence, loss, longing, and in some cases, freedom. Then came Elijah. He showed up on a quiet Sunday morning, unannounced, holding a takeout box of pancakes and a coffee with too much cream. Zachariah opened the door expecting conversation. Instead, Elijah just stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his brother. Tighter than words. He didn't say, I'm proud of you. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Zachariah held on like he was anchoring to something new, something true. They sat in the living room for hours, not to dissect theology or strategize next steps, but to just exist, 2 brothers, 2 lives unfolding without shame. Later that week, Zachariah packed a bag and drove to a quiet retreat outside Asheville. He didn't go for prayer or to be restored. He went to be still, to write, to listen. He drafted a letter not to his father, but to Noah. You were right, I was afraid, I still am. But I heard your voice on that stage and realized the boy you loved didn't die. He just got quiet. I'm letting him speak again. Thank you for not becoming bitter when you had every right to be. He never hit send, but it didn't matter. The truth had already been spoken, publicly, fully, irrevocably. Weeks later, the university offered to extend his contract with an invitation to design a new course titled Faith in Human Experience. No one asked him to shrink. Not this time. Zachariah walked across campus one afternoon, sun warm on his shoulders, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't rehearse how to walk, how to look, how to sound. He just moved. He wasn't healed, he wasn't whole, but he was here, and that was more than enough. And sometimes being seen is not the end of your story, it's where it finally begins. Have you ever stayed silent to feel safe? What would it mean to finally speak your truth, even just to yourself? Tell us in the comments below. Your voice might be the one someone else is waiting to hear. If this story moved, you don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories for more true, powerful stories that deserve to be heard. We tell them because someone somewhere needs to know they're not alone.